All right. Great. Okay. So, hello everyone. Hi. How are you feeling today? All is well?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah. So, my name is Tam Abdelazim. I'm part of the Gender Related Issues Committee in VOIS Cyprus, and I welcome you today to our workshop. As you already know from the title, we're going to be speaking about human trafficking, the signs, how can we reach full help, and more points. Also, relative legislation. Our guest speaker, Fezile Osum, is going to cover more points than you can even imagine. So yes, our guest speaker, it's an honor for you to be here. It's an absolute pleasure. Among many things, she is currently working as the Refugee Rights and Anti-Trafficking Program Coordinator in the Human Rights Platform. Of course, Fezile can tell us more about yourself. I wouldn't do you justice. The Human Rights Platform is a collaboration between 5 organizations, including the Refugee Rights Association, Queer Cyprus, as well as, I think, Civil Society Initiative and more organizations as well. So, of course, Fizra, you can tell us more about that if you may. I'll go over the program briefly for our workshop today. So we're gonna start with our guest speaker presenting. We're gonna be divided into groups for a group activity, which that should be fun. We're gonna have a 15-minute break after. Then we're gonna resume with cases. We're gonna be discussing actual cases, and we're gonna be taking your questions after that. If you have any questions, you may write them down in the chat box, and we're gonna get to them toward the end. So that's our program for the day. Fizere, thank you for being here.
Yes.
Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tam. Thank you very much for the introduction. And hi, everyone. Tam already, provided information about my background. As she said, I'm currently working in the Human Rights Platform. And I'm a lawyer, actually, but I don't practice law at the moment. I'm working as a program coordinator, rather. But in the past, I did work as a practicing lawyer in the field of refugee rights, as the lawyers of the refugees and asylum seekers in the northern part of Cyprus. And I have also worked in the civil society in Turkey in the past on gender equality, freedom of expression, and generally on human rights. And I am also a PhD student, and I mainly work on conflict-related sexual violence. But today I'm here for explaining you the human trafficking. What does it mean, and what kind of actions can be taken about it? What are the risks, and what are the signs for human trafficking? So, as Tayam said, I'm also thinking to have a case study with you. I prepared a case that is a real case. That is a case that was we dealt in the past. So everything in that case is real, and it happened in the northern part of Cyprus. And we will split into groups, and I will ask you to answer some of the questions about the case. But firstly, I want to share my screen and show you a video before we start everything. And by the way, if you have the chance to open your cameras, I would feel more comfortable when I see you. Or if you can interact with me throughout the training, that would be perfect. And so before we start, and before even I move into the video, I want to ask you, what do you know about human trafficking? What are the first few words that comes to your mind about human trafficking? I mean, how does it sound to you? What does it resemble to you? And anyone who wants to make a comment on that, just raise your hands and introduce yourself briefly so that I can start knowing you as well and I can meet with you. Does anyone have any opinions on human trafficking? Yeah. Anyone, any ideas about what is human trafficking, or what are the few words that comes to your mind?
Yeah.
Yes, Ashraf. Sorry. So we have Ashraf and
Can you
Makai.
hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes, hello, Fazila, and hello, everyone. Thank you once again, Fazila, for coming to the workshop and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. And thank you, everyone, also for attending this workshop. Just my quick thoughts about human trafficking personally. I mean, there is a lot that can be said about human trafficking. Really, we can speak about it for a whole day, I think. But me and Maghazi were discussing yesterday, actually, and Maghazi told me something that I think really struck a chord with me and explained how human trafficking is, which she said that it's exploiting vulnerabilities, which was it was really brilliant, like two words. When you really think about it, how um, in poverty or people who are in poor conditions, whether it's like, for example, some certain groups or communities, marginalized communities, students, etc. It shows how human traffickers prey on really, like, let's say, vulnerable people. And I think at least one of the ways or the best ways is to address it from the root is to remove those vulnerabilities and remove try to that are going through would be the one of the main and best ways to solve human trafficking. At least these are my opinion and my two cents on the issue. And yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you, Ashraf. So you pointed out rightfully the exploitation of the vulnerabilities of people by traffickers, and yes, we will come into that. And you're right about that, Ashraf. That's one of the most common things that traffickers are actually using advantage of. That are the vulnerabilities of the people. So, and happy to have you here, Ashraf. Atom, did I spell it right?
Yes, you pronounced it right. Actually, Ashraf said most of what I wanted saying. But just to add to what he said, most of these traffickers take advantage of the vulnerables and then make profit out of it. We find out that most of these traffickers, it's for their profit gain that they take advantage, they exploit people. So, yes.
Yes, Atom. That is the vulnerabilities, like as you and Ashraf emphasize. Yes, it's one of the things that we will come into, and you're definitely right. And Palma.
Okay, hello.
Hi.
Hi, okay, my name is Palma. When you say human trafficking, the first thing that comes to mind is violence. And also this movie called Taken, I think, where this man's daughter goes on holiday and then she gets kidnapped because she talks to a stranger. He spends the whole movie trying to find his daughter. The part that strikes me is the one at the end where you see all the other women that no one came to rescue who have also been trafficked and exploited. And obviously, the first thing that comes to mind because I'm a woman is trafficking for sexual exploitation. And then also cases like Libya, where migrants from African countries were trying to get to Europe, but then they ended up being stuck in Libya and sold into slavery. Cases like Dubai, where maids went to work and then, they got killed and all these other things. So I think they exploit you for work. They exploit you sexually. And sometimes it's not always strangers. Sometimes it's a relative who says, life is better out here. Come here. You're not studying. You become a maid and then everything goes downhill from there.
Yeah, Palma. And then the movie that you mentioned is really like it's one of the most known movies in the field of human trafficking. And thanks to you for mentioning about that movie. Yes, as you said, it involves violence definitely, and it involves people being sold for interest. It can be either direct interest or indirect interest. It can be from people that they know or they don't know at all. So as you pointed out, for especially for sexual exploitation, and we see that in most cases women do know their traffickers beforehand, or they might think that they have a love relationship with their traffickers. They might be in a love relationship, and they might be dependent on their traffickers with emotions. We see that kind of cases, especially in sexual exploitation of women. And yes, and thank you for all your comments, and nice to have you here. Nice to meet with you. And Makazi, hello.
Hello, my dear Fezile. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be a part of this workshop. As for like your question, I think the things that clicks most with me when I hear about human trafficking is like retrieving passports and personal information of people. I think this is like the biggest red flag for me. Once someone doesn't have access to their documents, their own documents and their passport, I feel like this is a sign that needs the intervention of the people around them. Just other signs, I feel like, especially for sexual exploitation, it looks sometimes really like domestic violence, meaning the intimidation. It looks like the sexual exploitation, of course, but it's also the financial exploitation, the emotional manipulation, like you said. There's a lot of factors that looks like domestic violence. So some signs are visible, but some signs you just need to look out for it. The paranoia of survivors when they're around, feeling dependency on the abusers or the traffic. But those are the signs that I'm aware of with regards to human trafficking and sexual exploitation.
Yes. Yeah, Makazi. I mean, it's good that, like, hearing all of your thoughts. I think you all know human trafficking at some point. I mean, to a certain level, you are aware of the indicators. As Makazi also mentioned, this manipulation, emotional manipulation, is quite common. And we would come to the reasons of that, why emotional manipulation especially, and then domestic violence and abuse is quite common in our era, whereas in the past it wasn't that common because the laws were different. But we will come into that. Thank you very much for your input, Markaze, and happy to have you here. So yes, I mean, human trafficking is actually about if you think a business, for instance, you would need to have a commodity for to run your business. And in human trafficking, unfortunately, the commodity is the human body. And it is something that, as you know, for instance, for drug sale, that is an illegal activity as well. And it's also one of the most common organized crimes in the world. But for instance, if you think about drug sale or gun sale, you sell it and it's one time and it's finished. But in human trafficking, because it concerns human body, you sell it again and again and again, and it renews itself. Why it's so popular? Because you can get a lot of money from human trafficking, because your commodity never ends, because a living human being. That's the painful side of the issue. That's the, unfortunately the ugly truth. Human trafficking is amongst the most committed organized crimes globally. It's, I think, the second or the first most committed organized crimes. And then we have gun sale, gun trade, and drug trade as other forms of organized crimes. So we are talking about an organized and global phenomenon around the world. So why in the past it was something different and now it's all about manipulation, is because in the past, unfortunately, the laws in some regions of the world were allowing slavery explicitly. So slavery was obvious, it was under the law, and it was written on paper that someone could own another person. Whereas today, we are talking about modern slavery, which is slavery is prohibited under the law, and no one can own another person legally on paper, but they can do so through manipulation, through making themselves themselves dependent, and many other forms that we will discuss in a bit. So first, and that is one of the most challenging sides when you work on human trafficking in the field today, because it's very difficult to identify and to make the decision who is the victim and who is not the victim, who are the traffickers and not. Everything goes so blurry and everything goes so uncertain in today's world. So you need to be very careful about when you assess a case or when you see someone who are in need of help and you think that they might be victims of human trafficking. That's why today we're gonna first identify human trafficking, and I will mention you briefly about the international framework on human trafficking. We will cover the indicators. We will cover different forms of exploitation, and then we'll go into the local legislation in the northern part of Cyprus and the services provided by Refugee Rights Association and Human Rights Platform that are my organizations. But before going into my presentation, I want to show you a video that I find quite informative. It's produced by the Blue Campaign. I don't know if you have ever heard about the Blue Campaign. Informative videos throughout the US to create awareness on human trafficking. So let's check the video first. So yes, do you see the video? Sorry, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think we can hear the audio though of the video.
You cannot hear it?
Could you stop sharing? And then once you try to share the tab, you click on share computer sound.
Sorry. Maybe it's because I used the
No, it's fine. Try to share again the same tab at the bottom. You would see share audio, share sound.
Yeah. I think, okay. I'm trying to share it, but it's something. So I think there's a problem with my Zoom. It's not upgraded, I think. Okay, I'll share you the link, and maybe you can watch it on your own. Sorry for that.
That's okay.
So this is the link. If you have the time, just watch it. It's like 4.5 minutes. And I'm now going into my presentation. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Yes, so we begin. And so if you want to ask anything or if you want to say anything throughout the training, I don't know if I'll be able to see you, but Tamaya, maybe you can just warn me if anyone is, raising their hands or wants to ask questions along the way. Would that be okay?
It's okay, I can take care of that.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, thank you. So first we will begin with what is human trafficking. So, yes. So what is human trafficking? The legal definition of human trafficking is rather drafted very late under the international legal framework. So it is a very recent crime, unfortunately, under the international law. So the universally agreed definition of human trafficking came in 2000 under the Palermo Protocol. Maybe you heard about this protocol before. The protocol is about the organized crimes, and it's a UN convention, sorry. And the Palermo Protocol is a supplementary document of the UN's Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and it specifically covers human trafficking. So I put you the explanation in this article, which is very long and very complex. And as a lawyer myself, I also found it very difficult to understand when I first saw this explanation. So I will not read it out. But what I did is that I split it into 3 elements. So in this long paragraph, there are 3 elements that we should consider on human trafficking. That is the act, the means. These 3 elements in a case, then you would really say that there is human trafficking going on. So let's check the elements. So first, we need an act. So we need a trafficker, a potential, let's say, recruiter, or let's say an employer. And then we need a victim, a potential victim. So first thing that we should see is recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. So if someone hires a person for a job, or transports them to one city to another, or one country to another, or harbors them or receives them in a country, then that would cover the act. Once we have the act, and then we see the second element, that is the means. What is the means? The means is the method or the tool used by the traffickers to exploit that, to traffic that person. What can be the means? It might be either threat or use of force. It can be like physical force or any other forms of coercion. And then it might be abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or abuse of a position of vulnerability. So in the beginning, Ashraf mentioned that traffickers take advantage of the vulnerabilities of people. Yes, that's absolutely true, but that's not the only method. The other methods, like Makazi mentioned about the physical abuse, for instance, that's also another method, or threats of violence. I mean, you don't have to see the violence itself, but if there's a threat of violence, that's also counts. And then you might deceive the person about the working conditions, for instance. You might lie to them. This is something that we see quite often as well. For instance, especially women and the sexual exploitation cases. We see that women are brought into Cyprus with other promises, like a decent salary, a decent job, rights, service contract, and they were giving a lot of false promises about their future job in Cyprus. But once they arrived, and they realized that everything told to them was basically false information, just to bring them into Cyprus and traffic them. So this is also something we see very common, especially in sexual exploitation cases. So this is the means. And then we have the third element. So first we have the act and the means, and then the third element is the purpose. So all these things should have a purpose. And what is our purpose? Our purpose is exploitation, as you know. So exploitation has different forms. It might be sexual exploitation. It might be forced labor or services, slavery, or practices similar to slavery. servitude, or removal of the organs. Sorry for this. Sorry, shut my phone. So it might be for like these reasons, but the exploitation mentioned under Palermo Protocol and the forms that I mentioned to you here is expanding under international human rights legislation right now. So don't think that, okay, it's only sexual exploitation or labor exploitation or removal of organs. There might be new forms of human trafficking, for instance, forcing someone into criminal activities, forced marriages, selling of babies, abduction of babies. These are all new forms of human trafficking, relatively new, and especially forcing someone into criminal activities is, according to the global reports, it's being increasing throughout the world. So in the past, we could only mention about sexual exploitation or labor exploitation, but now we see that there are other areas that should be covered in human trafficking field. So this is the 3 elements of human trafficking that we covered. And this is the technical side of the issue. If you don't have a legal background or political science, but I just want to mention you that when you think of human trafficking, the easiest way to think about it is whether to see whether the victim is being controlled by any other person. So control might be in different ways, either economic control, their restrictions on their freedom of movement, restrictions on, for instance, seeing a doctor, for instance, it's a right. But if their right to health is restricted, they cannot go to the hospital, for instance, or they cannot socialize with their friends, or they don't have their identity documents with them and it's being taken by their traffickers, for instance. These are strong signs that this person is being controlled. So in human trafficking, the first thing that should come to your mind is whether this person is being controlled, whether that person can establish their free will, or if they are forced into things that they do not consent to. So we will come into the indicators in a bit, which you would have, more ideas about what are the, signs of human trafficking and what are the alarming signs that you should consider. But so when we come to the forms of the exploitation before that, like I said, there are new forms of human trafficking evolving today. The most common form of human trafficking is sexual exploitation, with 50% globally. This is the global data of UNODC. And UNODC receives information from 148 countries worldwide and establish annual human trafficking reports. So I think this data is very valuable. And so we know that it's 50% sexual exploitation and 38% forced labor, which commonly we see forced labor in Cyprus as well, in construction sector, agriculture, service industry, and not in Cyprus, but in other countries. We see it in fishing sector, for instance. And so these are quite common sectors for forced labor. And then we have the criminal activity, like I mentioned to you before, the forcing someone into criminal activity. And mostly it's drug trafficking, pickpocketing, or robbery. This is 6% right now, but it's been increasing sharply. When you check other reports of UNODC, you see that this is increasing worldwide. And then we have begging as 1.5%, and then forced marriages 1%, and removal of organs, which is less than 1%. If we talk about Cyprus, In Cyprus, until today, I've seen only sexual exploitation and forced labor, to be honest. And I haven't come across to criminal activity, begging, forced marriages, or removal of organs. Removal of organs are very rare anyway, globally. In our region, Egypt had a lot of cases of removal of organs in the past, but they are also, they are also working on decreasing this amount of cases. But I can say that in our region, it's not very common. For the criminal activity, I am assuming that it's happening in North Cyprus, and I hear things about criminal activity, but we had no cases that reached to us for this type of exploitation up until today. So I cannot really confirm that it exists, let's say technically, but I strongly believe that it does exist in North Cyprus. So anyone has any questions up until here? Like, do you understand the concepts, or does anything sound confusing for you?
Not at all, actually. I'm really enjoying this. You're acing it.
Nice. Happy to hear that. Okay, so I'm moving on. But I think, Makazi, do you have anything to say, or?
Yeah, I have a quick question so I don't forget by the end of the session. With regards to forcing survivors to conduct criminal activities, when we speak legally, those who have been forced to like do criminal activities, are they going to be like held accountable by the law? Same as like a regular person who committed criminal activities, or are there like more quote unquote mercy when it comes to like legal procedure? Yeah.
In here, right? In North
Yeah,
Cyprus.
yeah, in the times.
Yeah, I mean, we will come to the local legislation here, but I believe that it covers, I mean, it doesn't explicitly refer into criminal activities, but it does refer to forcing someone into doing like some services for you or something like that. So I mean, there's a broad concept or explanation used in the article. So I think, legally speaking, I believe that it would go under the Human Trafficking article, but it's not explicitly referred, whereas sexual exploitation and forced exploitation and removal of organs are explicitly mentioned in the article. But I think it does cover criminal activity as well. But I mean, if we have a case in close future, I would really like to try this in the court and see what the judges would think, because we didn't have such a case until today. Yes. So, okay, I continue now with the factors that are used by human traffickers. So this is from the UNODC report again, the global data report on human trafficking, and this is the most recent data that they collected. It's the report of 2021. So what are the factors used by traffickers? So why these people are being exploited, and why they go into this kind of heavy violence cycle in their lives. So 51% of the cases includes the victims with economic needs. So this is a very common factor that human traffickers use. So basically, especially people living in places of the world where economic growth is very limited, there is poverty, there's high unemployment rates, and there's no social welfare state, and they are basically desperate about in terms of the economic conditions of in their lives. So this is one of the most common factors. And the other factor, child with a dysfunctional family. So when you don't have a family that takes care of you and that can meet your needs as parents, then you are also very vulnerable, and you look to other people to take care of you, and you might become very dependent on them. You might not know how to continue your life and what to do about your life, basically. So this is also another factor. And then there is the intimate partner as traffickers. Like I said in the beginning, this is most common in sex trafficking cases. So in sex trafficking, traffickers approach to women as their partners, and the relationship might start as a love relationship, as an intimate relationship, where they really act like they're in love with the victim, and they build a kind of a partnership with the victim, and then they force them into sex trafficking. The other factor is mental, behavioral, and neurological disorders. This is also a factor to take into account. Another factor is immigration status. That is when you have people with irregular stays in a country. So when they don't have a legal residency permit, and when you don't have a legal residency permit in a country, that makes you very vulnerable, because in most jurisdictions, you are in risk of deportation. You cannot access to your basic rights because of your immigration status, like health or education, and you are constantly fearing from the police and the local authorities. And you might want to approach to the people that might help you in that condition in a very vulnerable manner. That is how human traffickers use these kind of migrants as well. And when there is a child deprived of paternal care, that's also something that we covered in the beginning. So when there's a child, an unaccompanied minor, or the parents are there but they're not taking care of their child, then the child might leave home or seek to meet with new people that they might be friends with, or they might be or they might think that these people will help them up through, like, by taking them into other countries or other regions in their own country. This is especially in big countries like US, you would find these kind of cases where the children or teenagers of that families would want to leave home but don't know where to start, so they just trust a guy or a woman and they promise them to give them a bright future, and they go on a journey together, and then they realize that they end up in another state in US, and that they might be trafficked. So, and then the other factor is limited education or knowledge of foreign language. This is also mostly something that is faced by, that might be faced by migrants in our country, or with the families that have low income status, or families that they live, or people that they live in rural areas. Because of their education or because of their knowledge on foreign languages or any language, they might be vulnerable. And then you have the physical disability as one of the factors that is used by human traffickers. Physical disability is especially a factor for begging. So traffickers would go after to find persons with physical disabilities and force them into begging in the streets. It's not, I mean, I haven't seen such a case in Cyprus or anyone begging, like in other big countries where you would see people begging in the streets and it's a common practice. But in Cyprus, no questions, then I continue and we discuss at the end. So agencies used as a shield. This is very important. The agencies in human trafficking are like one of the most common methods or tools used by the traffickers, these third parties or agencies. This is the case in Cyprus as well. And the case, the context in Cyprus really reflects the global context as well. Because in different sectors, you would come across recruitment agencies. These agencies find people like to work for construction, agriculture, service, entertainment industry, and would hire people from foreign countries and would bring people to work in a certain specific country. And they are like a bridge between the employer and the employee. Well, in the countries where there is good kind of like established legal framework, rule of law, human rights, and where you see that the exploitation is relatively low, these kind of agencies are actually useful because they are the ones that foreign workers or students can receive information about the country context, can find jobs according to their needs, and they actually meet the employers with the employees. That is very good for the global market as well, because you can really want to hire someone from another, from abroad, and you might not know where to start. And these kind of agencies would help you to find people according to your needs, basically. But in most of the countries, unfortunately, these agencies are not being monitored by the state effectively. This is the case in our country as well. And these agencies work together with human traffickers, or sometimes the agencies are owned by the human traffickers, but on paper they're just owned by other people. They're used as a shield, and just not to show to the society that they're doing something criminal there. So they really establish legal agencies. They try to hide the criminal activities behind it. And in our country, my experience shows that the agencies are mostly working very closely with human traffickers. They're not owned by human traffickers, but they mostly work together with human traffickers. They're not all of them, but there are some agencies in different cities that we know that they systematically cooperate with human traffickers. So these kind of recruiters, when they start working with traffickers, they mostly go into countries or regions in specific countries where there's high poverty, low education, where people are desperate to find jobs abroad. They send people to these kind of regions and promote their work and try to recruit people with false promises and basically by giving them hopes or dreams. Well, in the case of Cyprus, I'm sure you all heard about this, but I've heard Cyprus is being represented by these kind of recruitment agencies as northern part of Cyprus as being an EU state, that there is a high employment rate, that the wages are really good, paid in euros or dollars, and that if they come to Cyprus, it would be very easy for them to find a job. And if they don't like the job, they can change the job and find a new job very easily and stuff like that. So we hear this kind of false promises being given to people just to traffic them. So agencies are very important. And then we have the indicators. So this is indicators is a whole topic that we could spend a day on. So I tried to limit the kind of the indicators here for each type of exploitation. But just let me first explain you why indicators are important. So as we said, there are different forms of human trafficking: labor, sex, criminal, domestic servitude, and begging are some forms. And human trafficking cases, mostly they don't have a yes or no kind of an answer. So when you have a human trafficking case, you need to be very careful when you interview a victim, or when you think that your friend might be trafficked, or a person that you know, or your neighbor, or whoever else that you think might be trafficked. You need to be very careful, because human trafficking today might happen in very complex forms, and it's very difficult. It's getting very difficult and difficult each day to identify the victims, because human traffickers use the methods that wouldn't really show that they are trafficking these people, through emotional manipulation, through making these people believe that they actually like their job and they actually love their traffickers, for instance. So, and with this digital era as well, it has been very difficult to control and penalize human traffickers, because digital recruitment is also very wide globally. But for now, I want to just cover briefly the most common indicators. So the indicators that when you see this in a person's life, or in a case that comes to your organization, let's say, you should be alarmed that this might be human trafficking. So labor exploitation. In labor exploitation, when you have a case from agriculture or from construction sector, for instance, that are the two frequent forms happening in the northern part of Cyprus, you need to check first the case that came to you, the person that reached to you, does that person live at the same place that they work? And the place that they live, is it decent or is it unsuitable for human beings to stay, basically? Do they have access to their earnings? Do they have long working hours? Do they have a working contract? Do they have limitation on their freedom of movement? For instance, are they allowed to live where they're taken, or they are living with other laborers? Are they free to leave that building? Are they free to ask for leave from their employers? Or are they free to spend whole weekend on their own, doing whatever they want, or do they have limitations in their job environment? Do they have access to food, like proper food? Are they being disciplined through fines by their employers? Are they subjected to insults, abuse, threats, or violence? Or do they lack basic training or professional licenses? Or if their employer or manager is unable to show the documents required for employing these kind of workers? Or are their employer or manager is unable to show records of payments for their salaries? So these are the most common forms. I know it's a long list, but I just want to emphasize, because I'm going to share the presentation with you anyway, so you can check it on your own free time. But I want to emphasize one thing in labor exploitation, especially. In the field, when I work in the field with the police, or even with other civil society activists, okay, there is one kind of misconception. People think that if a person receives a salary or receives some amount of their salaries from their employers, then this is not trafficking. Or some people think that long working hours might not really point out human trafficking, because long working hours are in all sectors, let's say. Or for instance, like sleeping in the same place where they work. It's very normalized in the northern part of Cyprus, like living in groups, especially in the construction site. You will see that the construction workers are living in the construction site, which is not safe, not healthy, and not decent. But you would see amongst the local people as well that these practices being normalized. And when you tell the people, but they live in these conditions and it's not decent and it's not healthy, they immediately, you see that they would normalize, they would try to normalize it. They would say, oh, in their countries, they didn't even have a place to stay, we give them a place to stay, this kind of racist comments. Or for the work long hours as well, they would try to justify it by saying in their countries they wouldn't earn that much money and we give them high amount of money and stuff like that. So we see, unfortunately, especially for labor exploitation, we see that the practices of exploitation are being normalized. And for the salaries as well, if a person receives some part of their salaries or even receives full salary, doesn't matter, doesn't mean that they're not being trafficked. If two or more of these indicators are existent in the case, they are being trafficked, even though they receive the full amount of the salary. It doesn't matter. So you should be really careful whether you can find two or more indicators that I've listed here in a case. If you have two or more indicators, then this is a red alarm for you to try seriously to consider whether this is a human trafficking or not. So this is labor exploitation. And then we have the sex trafficking. So sex trafficking globally is easier to identify. And according to some academicians, that is one of the major reasons why it's 50% under the global data, because it's more visible. There is more awareness on this issue compared to labor trafficking or begging or criminal activities. And since it has been discussed globally, like very widely compared to other forms of trafficking, and some academicians do argue that it's not because that labor trafficking is less than sex trafficking, it's because sex trafficking is identified much more easily by CSOs or international actors compared to other forms of trafficking. I agree to this point to some extent. I think there's a role this is one of the factors why sex trafficking is the highest. But I also do think that it's one of the most common forms of exploitation. So it doesn't change this fact actually. So in sex trafficking, like in labor trafficking, they sleep where they work. They work for very long hours. They don't have access to their identity documents. They don't have cash money on their own. They don't have freedom of movement. So they would be escorted wherever they go by their traffickers or the bodyguards of their traffickers or security, whoever that their trafficker is working with. There is evidence that they're being controlled by others. And there is evidence that suspected victims cannot refuse unprotected or violent sex. So these indicators in sex trafficking, in our country as well, all of these indicators are very common. So they're, it's easy and straightforward to identify. And then we have the criminal activities. There aren't many indicators about this. But some of the indicators is carrying or selling illicit drugs, punishments when they don't steal enough, if someone is forced in the robbery or small kind of pickpocketing, being part of large groups of children who have the same adult guardian. You would see that it's not common in Cyprus, but you would see this kind of groups in like big countries, like for instance in Istanbul, you would see in the streets like children or young teenagers going around together, committing crimes or begging, and they're controlled by one single adult guardian. And then you might have living with the members of the same group. This might be a gang group. And traveling with the members of the group, again, I'm referring to the gang groups, to the country of destination. So this is criminal activities. And then you have domestic servitude, which is, in my opinion, and also according to most of the colleagues in the field, it's one of the most invisible forms of human trafficking. Domestic servitude is very difficult to identify, and victims or potential victims have many challenges when they try to reach out for help. And they are very vulnerable, and they're mostly women in the domestic servitude sector. So I I think it's their vulnerabilities and exploitation are very invisible in the literature and in civil society work in general, unfortunately. So in domestic servitude, like the others, you might have victims living and working at the same place. They don't have private spaces most of the time. They live with a family. They stay in an inappropriate space. So either in a garage or a very small room, or their room or might not be very decent or healthy. They don't have the permission to leave the house, or they rarely leave the house. They don't have proper food to eat. They're not allowed to eat with the family members. They work for very long hours. They don't have, they cannot just take leaves from their job. They are subjected to insults, abuse, threats, or violence, especially sexual violence. There is no such a data in the north about domestic servitude, but in the south, there is a very recent data that especially women trafficked in the domestic sector are unfortunately being, they're subjected to sexual violence, especially rape, and it's quite common. And yes, these are the factors. And we have begging in the public places, in visible places, being punished when they don't collect enough money. The begging mostly involves unaccompanied minors dependent on one single adult that is not their relative at the end of the day, and having physical impairments that appear to be the result of mutilation. Like I said, it's not, I haven't come across such a case in Cyprus, either in the south or in the north, but it doesn't mean that it will not happen in the close future, so it's good to be alarmed. So yes, any comments or questions or anything that you feel like you need to ask right now, otherwise, you know, you would not feel comfortable enough with the rest of the presentation. Do you have any comments? Or does that sound confusing for you? No?
We do have a question. Do you want me to read it out?
Yes.
Okay, from our president, Ashraf. I have a question. Often here in TRNC, we see children or women selling flowers or tissues and such. Are they related to gangs or trafficking in any way, to your knowledge?
According to my knowledge, they are not. Mostly these kind of cases are because of either the family or the parents cannot take care of their children. They have economic difficulties. That's why their parents are kind of forcing them to sell these flowers, but it's not really related with the gang. Well, if you ask me, I mean, forcing a child to sell flowers in the street, I think this goes under human trafficking, according to the international definition. But when I reported some of the cases to social welfare in here, especially there was a case in Famagusta, a very young boy was selling flowers, and they didn't consider it under human trafficking. Yes. So before I move into the next slides, I want to do the case study with you right after the indicators. Actually, I was gonna do it with groups, but then I changed my mind. It would be better to do it as a whole big group and take all of your, you know, opinions, like, and give the floor to everyone to speak and express their opinions. I will share you the case. I think it should be, it's not a very difficult case. It's rather a straightforward case. But I will ask you some questions to identify within the case study.
That would be great. In the meantime, everyone, to ensure maximum participation, would you prefer to open your cameras if that's possible so we could all, interact together?
So I sent, yeah, it will be good if everyone can open their cameras, and I've sent you the case through the chat. So this case is, like I said, it's a real case, is from the words, it's the words of the victim, basically. I did reconstruct some of the sentences on my own, but generally speaking, the case is real. Everything happened in this case in like last year or 2 years ago, something like that. So in Cyprus. So I will give you 10 minutes to read the case, to understand. And I first ask you to first identify what is the type of exploitation here. What are the factors that cause this person to be trafficked? And what are the indicators of human trafficking? And I want you to conclude at the end by establishing these answers, whether this is a trafficking victim or not. The case is very straightforward, like I told you. But if you don't understand anything, I mean, if you have any questions, you can write through the chat. I'll be here. So just write to me what are the types of exploitation, the indicators, what are the factors, and whether this is a human trafficking victim or not. And I give you 10 minutes. Just take your own notes, and after 10 minutes, I'll come back here and we can start the discussion all together. Okay, how does it sound to you? Okay, perfect. Yes, everyone, are you done with the case?
Yes, I have read it. Is everybody else ready for us to discuss?
Yeah. So when you look to this case, what are the factors do you think that these people, this person involved in this case was trafficked? So what is the factors of vulnerabilities you think that led to human trafficking in this case? Kaya?
Basically, there was a repeated emphasis on economic need and economic problem and financial distress. And this is, I think, the major factor when we're discussing this case.
Yes, that's correct. And the Makazi?
I mean, which one? There seems to be a repetition of names. I don't know what the issue is, but everyone is showing as Murad, and I hope like it's getting fixed.
There are 3 Makazis now.
Yeah,
Makazi. I don't know why.
But yeah, I want to also say I think gender plays a role as well. The experience would have been totally different if there was different gender or at least gender identity. So I think that played a role alongside the financial difficulties that Tayam mentioned.
Yes. And gender, especially like females, are being targeted for sexual exploitation. And also, in some cases, this is not, I mean, it's not the case for this one, but in some cases, we see that because of gender based violence in their home countries, women want to escape, and this puts them in a vulnerable situation. So, when they have a systematic kind of domestic violence in their homes, they want to seek for opportunities in other countries, and they just trust to the people that offers them a good job opportunity in another country, preferably in Europe or close to Europe. That's also one of the pull factors. And Cyprus is, for instance, this case happened in the northern part of Cyprus. This is it's also a destination country because it's located in Europe, and traffickers really explain to the victims that this is an EU territory and you will have this kind of rights and that, and like makes dependent on their job offer basically, and pulls them to Cyprus. So yes, and then Nancy.
Yes, I think another indicator in the case that shows that this was a trafficking case is also, it was mentioned, the transportation. When she was transported, she was locked up and monitored, and also the idea that she was fed the story of she could make money to change and live the life of her dreams, whereas the reality was different. So I think those also indicated that there was some form of trafficking going on.
Yeah, I mean, this would go under the indicators because of the vulnerabilities that we have discussed. Basically, this person was convinced with the words of the traffickers, false promises, false information about the content of the job and their rights and the salary and everything. Yes. And there is another Makazi, which is probably not the real Makazi. Yeah. Do you want to say something? No. Okay, I see.
So
Yeah.
probably it's me. I don't know if I'm showing, but my name is Atong.
Yeah, it shows as Makazi.
Oh,
sorry, Atong.
Magazi. It's okay. Another indicator is the method of living, their way of living there, being closed, being isolated, not being able to go out, and even to the extent that their medical checkups as well once a week, they're not allowed to communicate to the medical personnel. So their interaction, so method of living, it's an indicator.
Definitely. And the living conditions is also definitely one of the indicators, and restrictions, heavy restrictions on freedom of movement, definitely. And in most cases, it's the freedom of movement that is being restricted, and that's how you understand human trafficking is really going on, because control and freedom of movement are directly related. How you understand a person as being controlled when you see that they have no freedom to move. That's one of the most common indicators that you should really look at. Yes, and Fatima?
Yeah, also I think the language played a big role in this case, because if she knows Turkish, she may express the situation, so she may get help, I think so.
Definitely. So not knowing the language, not being citizen in that country, not knowing the language is also vulnerability. And that's why human traffickers mostly target migrants, and in sex trafficking, mostly migrant women. And for Cyprus, the women are mostly from Russia, Moldova, Morocco, Nigeria, and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. These are the most common nationalities that we see in sex trafficking of women. Yeah, that's also one of the factors that we should take into account. Any other indicators that made you think that this might be human trafficking? Okay, there is also one thing that I think was briefly mentioned, but I'm not sure about, unprotected sexual intercourse with the clients, and the physical abuse. Yes, the physical abuse is also one of the indicators, because she explains that she heard from other women who tried to escape that they were physically abused, so she couldn't really dare to escape, because she was so afraid that she would be also physically abused. And if you had such a case, if you had such a potential victim that you interviewed, and but at the end of the day, she told you that, yes, I wasn't happy with my conditions, but I consented to this. So I have full consent, because I knew that I would do prostitution, and I knew that I would work for this sector, and I don't want my employer to be in trouble because of me. Do you think that this changed the result of the case? Would you still identify that person as human trafficking victim, or you wouldn't? Yes, Tayam?
It's still trafficking, definitely still trafficking, because I really believe that since traffickers, as you already explained, might be very close to you, or they might develop a relationship with you, you might feel obligated to protect them. And that's why you can claim that you consented, but really you were manipulated.
Definitely, yes. And Palma?
Yes, I agree. It's definitely still trafficking. It's just because of maybe emotional abuse. That's why you don't want to press charges and say you consented to it, or because of fear. You understand that if this person can move so many people across continents, they might be above the law. So pressing charges might be detrimental for your safety, but it's still trafficking.
Yes, definitely. It's still trafficking. So this is also provided under the Palermo Protocol, which is the globally agreed definition of human trafficking. It's also explicitly stated under the Palermo Protocol that if the factors, the elements of human trafficking as a crime is there, which in this case is fully there, then consent of the victim is irrelevant. So because the idea behind this is that no human being can consent to such conditions because of the human rights standards, because no human being can consent to be a slave or to live in inhumane conditions. So even though you would have victims or potential victims saying that they love their traffickers, they don't want their traffickers to be in jail, or they don't want to leave their traffickers, that's not the case. You should immediately proceed with the case, and you should identify the person as victim of human trafficking. The other thing that I want to point out is that when there is a minor involved in a case, when there is someone below the age of 18, then you don't need the means, the element of the means that we mentioned. What was the means is threat or physical abuse or debt bondage, these kind of practices that traffickers use as a tool to make that person dependent on themselves. For child victims, you don't need to prove these elements. So for child victims, you just need to prove that the victim is either abducted or transported or received in another country, and they are being forced into work for exploitation. So you don't need to prove that that person was given false promises or was physically abused or emotionally abused and stuff like that. For child victims, you just need two elements, because the logic is that a child does not have any kind of consent to any kind of things under the age of 18, any kind of, this kind of job or criminal activities. So you don't really need to prove that the means component of the crime is existent to provide that consent is not there, because the child cannot consent anyway. So for child victims, it's much more straightforward. But for adult victims, you need to prove either that person was given false promises or physically or emotionally abused or threatened with deportation or any other physical abuse or fraud. These kind of factors should be existent in the case. And in our case, we see that this woman was brought to Cyprus with the promise that she will work as a cleaner, she would have a good salary, she would live the life of her dreams, and that she would have basic labor rights and stuff like that. So she really believed that she's coming for cleaning, to work as a cleaner. So there is false promises given to this woman and false information about the content of the job, which is a very strong indication of human trafficking. So you should be careful about these factors when you assess a case. Any questions or, sorry for this, it's my signal. Yes. And any questions, any comments, or anything that you want to ask before we go into the break? Yes, Nancy.
I wanted to ask, in this case study, could we say that there's a combination of forced labor and sex trafficking undergoing? Can we?
And why forced labor?
Because they're made to provide services and not paid for this. They are not paid for. They don't receive any type of income whatsoever. I think in the case study it said she had to work and pay her debts before she would be set free, but she's not paid for anything. She's forced to provide this service, I think. So if, say, you wanted to make a case in court, could you charge for both sex trafficking as well as forced labor?
Well, under the legal framework, basically this would actually go under sex trafficking, because the services involve sexual intercourse, forced sexual intercourse, or commercial sex, however you name it. So this wouldn't really go under labor trafficking. I wouldn't argue that it's labor trafficking before the court. I would just go with sex trafficking because the indicators strongly show that it's sex trafficking, whereas for labor trafficking, it's mostly the sectors that doesn't involve commercial sex, like I said, agriculture or construction type of work. But sex trafficking is something different, and in this case we see all indicators match with sex trafficking, and the service involves sex trafficking, sexual intercourse itself. There is this kind of discussion in the literature, I can say in the academic literature mostly, not in civil society, but whether this sex trafficking, like you said, and labor trafficking can be considered as all together, because sex trafficking is also, in a way, labor trafficking. I agree with your point. But through time, the international legal framework has shaped by identifying these two as distinct forms. And mainly because to pay specific attention to sex trafficking cases and specifically to prioritize it, because sex trafficking was one of the points that were globally discussed much wider and in further detail compared to labor trafficking. And all the human trafficking discussions started with sex trafficking, actually. So that's why I think they are all two distinct forms in the international legal framework. Yes. Farah Ali?
Yeah, yes. Hello, how are you?
Hi. Okay.
So I wanted to ask you, how did they use the contract against her? Like, how did a contract that clearly stated that she's gonna be cleaning or she's gonna be a cleaner at a place turn into something that's used to impose that she has like debt some sort to them? Although there's no past encounters, like this kind of sparked my interest in a way.
Yes, very good question, Farah. Actually, debt bondage is one of the means used by the human traffickers, and this is existent in this case. And what is debt bondage is when you hire someone from abroad, either in their home country before they come here, or once they arrive here, you give them a contract or a legal document like a debt bondage document. We also have this kind of documents in our local legal framework here that shows that that person has a debt to you, and they need to pay it back. And how they pay it back, it's like either as a form of like how can I tell you? In Turkish, I know the word, but in English, I'm not sure. It's like the legal document when you sign with someone. These are used by gang or mafia so widely as well, which confirms that you have a debt up, for instance, $10,000 or $5,000 to that person. Or else you just give them a contract to sign. Again, it states that that person has a debt to this employer, this amount of money, and they will pay it back by working in this nightclub, for instance. This also can be a way. Probably you would think about whether this is legal or not. It's legal in a point that in that contract, it says that this person, this woman, will work in the nightclub for me to pay their, debt back. And this is agreed by the two parties, freely agreed by the two parties. Legally speaking, technically, yes, these kind of contracts are valid, but it doesn't state in the contract that this person would perform or would be forced into prostitution, of course. It just says that this person will work in the nightclub. And in our nightclubs, this was a case of a nightclub, by the way, in Cyprus. In our nightclubs law that I will explain in the second half of the workshop. In our nightclubs law, the law prohibits prostitution. So technically speaking, according to our laws, there is no prostitution going on in nightclubs. So working in nightclubs is purely legal. but everyone knows that there is prostitution going on there, and these women brought into the nightclubs are forced into commercial sex. But technically and legally speaking, these contracts or these step bondage legal documents that they use are legal, unfortunately, because it doesn't explicitly state that it's prostitution. They force women to sign these contracts. These contracts are mostly in Turkish language. They don't even understand the language. And the debt comes from, most of the time, because of the services provided by the agency to find that job, the money for the visa, and the money for the airplane tickets, and the money for the rent of the place that they stay, which we know that they stay in the nightclubs and they sleep where they work. So they sleep in the same rooms that they are forced into commercial sex. But the nightclubs owners charge this as a rent price and puts them into their contracts. And mostly, once they come here, they force them to sign contracts up until like around $10,000, for instance, or $5,000. It changes. And they tell them, okay, you sign this contract, we give you place to stay, we give you food, we buy you clothes, we bought your plane tickets. This is the debt you need to pay us back. And you need to work for us for like 2 months, 3 months for free until you pay your debt back. And then you can start earning money, they say to the woman. And the money is, how they get the money is not like monthly salaries or something like that. They can work for 6 months in the nightclubs anyway. And if they work for 3 months in total for free to pay their debt back, for the other 3 months, again, they receive no money at all. But when the day comes that they have to leave Cyprus, the traffickers give them some money. So this money changes. I heard women earning $5,000. I heard women earning nothing. I heard women earning $300. It changes. And how it changes is really like, it's really ugly and really like inhumane. How they charge this amount is through how the clients are happy about their performance or not. So if the clients are not happy about them, then they make reductions. If they have STDs occurred, they make these reductions, you know. So this all really depends on how much they can keep the clients happy. If the clients complain to the trafficker, then they might receive no money at all, for instance. So this is a method really common in nightclubs used to control women, like debt bondage, and this kind of reductions in their, let's say, salaries, or these are very common. And of course, these women have no access to their passports or identity documents as well. They are all withheld by the police, which will come again in a bit in the second half. So they cannot escape the country as well. Yeah, Palma?
You said that, well, most of the traffickers are considered the people, in this case, the people who brought the lady to the island and the lady who coerced her into coming here. But will the doctors also be considered as part of traffickers? Because in as much as we all want to have good health or STD checkups, if someone is coming to you every week for an STD checkup, doesn't that mean that something is wrong, or you know that, okay, this person might be into prostitution? And then is prostitution legal in Cyprus? Even outside of nightclubs, is it legal?
Prostitution, like if I work as a prostitute, it's legal. Like providing services, like providing sex services is legal. But what is not legal is that helping people to giving them places for providing sex services, working as third-party agencies to assist them in their, you know, to work as a sex worker, let's say, or to provide sex services. These are all prohibited. So the woman or whoever is doing this job, they wouldn't be criminalized, but anyone around them who assist them, give them a place, like rent them a building to do this job and stuff, they're all criminalized. So everything around it is criminalized. And buying sex services is also technically criminalized as well. So it's only the law only protects the sex worker itself and nothing else. Yes. So I can say that not sex work is not fully like legal. There is some kind of a protection given to the sex workers. I wouldn't say that it's fully legal because everything around this is illegal. And about the health workers, so it depends if you can prove in a case that sex work, the health workers are working in collaboration with human traffickers, they help them, or they help them to commit this crime, assist them, and then this would also go, I mean, this is also a crime, of course. Helping human traffickers is also a crime, surely. But it's difficult to prove this kind of assistance. Like, according to my experience, it's very difficult to prove it. So if there is no other questions, I suggest that we do a 10 minutes break and we come back for the second half, where we will go into the context in the northern part of Cyprus. And what do we face here? What are the challenges? What are the challenges faced by international students? And what are the services we provide as civil society to help human trafficking victims? Okay, so bear with me for the second half as well, but just rest for a few minutes and we will come back at 7. Okay? Yes. If you can open your cameras, I would prefer it that way. It will be good to see your faces. And yes. So I will share my screen. And now we will move into exploring what is going on in here. What is the local legislation here? And what are the challenges we face in the field when working with human trafficking victims, and the services being provided by civil society, basically. So let's move to the local legislation. According to the local legislation, up until 2020 March, human trafficking was not even identified as a crime in North Cyprus. So there were other kind of crimes in the criminal code, such as forced labor, or encouraging prostitution, or assisting prostitution, like I mentioned just before the break. But there was no specific crime for human trafficking. But in 2020, this changed. In March 2020, this changed, and now we have Article 254D under the Criminal Code that defines human trafficking and provides the relative punishments for human trafficking. The definition in the Criminal Code is in line with the Palermo Protocol's definition of human trafficking. So the definition that we have covered in the beginning, which I will take you now to the beginning of our presentation, just to remind you. So this is the definition of human trafficking in Palermo Protocol. And what we did in the first session, we did go through the act, the means, and the purpose of the crime. And this is exactly the same for the local legislation in North Cyprus. So we have the act, means, and the purpose. They are the same. This is a good improvement in the law, although it is very not enough or not completed. So it doesn't provide a comprehensive legal framework on human trafficking, which should be ideally the case. So in most countries, you would have a comprehensive law on human trafficking, which provides punishment for the crime itself. It defines the crime, provides the imprisonment sentences for the crime, and then provides protection to the victims, identifies the rights of the victims, and then maybe ideally provides some articles on prevention of the crime as well before it takes place. But in our local legislation, it's only human trafficking being penalized under the criminal code. So it is not a very good or developed legal framework we have here. We also adopted the Palermo Protocol in 2018 in our parliament. However, because of the Cyprus issue and the unrecognition of the state in the north, we lack the monitoring mechanisms for implementation of such international conventions or protocols adopted from the parliament, which gives which is a really huge gap in human rights in the north, because we lack the international pressure from UN or European Council of Europe, I may say. So this is also one of the problems. Yes, the protocol is adopted, and in the protocol, there are also articles on the protection of the victims. But when we see our local legal framework, our laws here, we see that there is no such a right granted to the victims, unfortunately. So when we see the article in Criminal Code 254B, we see that there's a maximum sentence of 10 years of imprisonment. And then there are heavier penalties when the victim is a child or when the crime is committed by a civil servant. So when the victim is a child, you would have 14 years of imprisonment. And when it is committed by a civil servant, you have 16 years of imprisonment. This article provides a partial protection for the victims as well. What is this partial protection? Is that when there's a victim identified under the law, then they wouldn't be prosecuted for any kind of crimes under alliance and immigration law. What does this mean? It might sound a little bit confusing for you, but it means that when a victim approaches to the authorities and they don't have a regular stay in Cyprus, so either they came with student visas or any other work permit or even tourist visas, and they exceeded the amount of the days that they should stay in North Cyprus, which puts them under the irregular stay, they would still approach to the police or the authorities and seek for help, and they wouldn't be punished for staying irregularly in Cyprus. So this is a very, very small protection provided to the victims. How it should be normally under the international standards is that no victim should penalize for any kind of crime that they went into or they committed as a result of the trafficking. So I think this law is very inadequate in terms of protecting other kinds of victims that are involved in drug sale or gangs, criminal activities, mafia's criminal activities, or any other kind of crime that they were forced to do so by their traffickers. It only provides a limited kind of protection under alliance and immigration law for their irregular stay or irregular work in the north. And under the law, it's explicitly stated that the consent of the victim is irrelevant. It's disregarded by the court. This brings us to the discussion that we had in the case study, is that even if the victim says, I did consent to these activities, I do love my trafficker, or I don't regret in involving this in this industry or in this kind of work, then it's still irrelevant for us, because if the elements are met and if they're there, then it's surely human trafficking, and the consent cannot be taken as a form of defense by the traffickers in the court. This is very important, and I think it's very good that it's explicitly indicated in our local legislation. So this is Article 254B. Up until today, there has been no single conviction under this article. It has been almost 2 years that human trafficking is criminalized. It has, alongside with other crimes such as hate speech and human smuggling. We did see several convictions on smuggling, whereas for hate speech or human trafficking, we see no conviction before the courts up until today. And we might come to the reasons of them, or of this. If you have any kind of questions about this, why it's happening this way, why it's not being penalized or investigated or prosecuted under our local system, and if you have any questions about that, we can go into that discussion. I think it's very interesting and it's good to know. But before coming into that, I also want to emphasize that yes, we have a legislation that prohibits human trafficking, but we have a legislation that also encourages human trafficking. These are two laws that, in my opinion and my experience, are systematically encouraging human trafficking. The first one is nightclubs and similar places of entertainment law, and the second is alliance and immigration law. And how does these laws encourage human trafficking is that the nightclubs and similar places of entertainment law is the law that establishes the nightclub sector in North Cyprus. There are currently 27 active nightclubs in the north, and under this law, there are 6 months work permits under barmaids or hostess work permits granted to women coming from a foreign country. So they just come with this visa type, which is a discriminatory visa type. And it's recommended that all states remove this kind of discriminatory visa types. This is another discussion. But also, under this law, it gives the full authority to the police to withhold the passports and identity documents of the women who are brought to Cyprus to work in the nightclubs, which is a clear indicator of human trafficking, as we discussed in the first part of the session. However, although it is known as a red flag and one of the most common indicators of human trafficking globally, it is still in our law. So our law actually embraces a human trafficking indicator. And what happens is that when the women are brought to Cyprus, their passports are taken away from them by the police immediately when they arrive to Ercan Airport. And they are taken to the nightclubs, and these nightclubs are located outside the city centers most of the time, with high protection, with bodyguards, dogs, and other workers that work to protect these nightclubs, mafia members or people who work for the mafia networks, basically. And again, under this law, it says that the woman working in the nightclub should be taken into the hospital for health checks. But we know in practice that this health check is STD check. The law says that prostitution is illegal in the nightclubs, but we all know that it takes place, and that's why women are taken into STD checks. The second legislation is Alliance and Immigration Law, Chapter 105. This law is a very old one. It's from the British colony times. It's the Republic of Cyprus in the south uses the same law as well, but they did improve the law very much so in the past 20 years, whereas our law is still very outdated, and it includes arbitrary power provided to the immigration officers to deport people, why it encourages human trafficking is that it leaves the migrant community very vulnerable in the north, that human traffickers use this as a threat for deportation against foreigners. Because under this alliance and immigration law, it says that a person can be deported just as a result of being involved in prostitution, or as a result of having a mental illness, or even poverty. It says, like, if a person lives in very poor conditions, that's a reason for deportation. Another reason for deportation is when you exceed the amount of legal stays that you should stay in the northern part of Cyprus. If you exceed that day, then the immigration authority has the full authority to deport you. Well, in the human trafficking article that I explained just before this slide, yes, it does provide a partial protection to the victims, because it says that they cannot be deported under the alliance of immigration law, then they cannot be criminalized under this law. But still, in practice, we see that first, not many people knows about this protection. The potential victims, and even civil servants, they don't know about this, and they automatically issue deportation orders without doing proper screenings of human trafficking in these kind of cases. So when these articles are, both in the nightclubs law or the alliance and immigration law are in place, then we can really comment that the law doesn't only prohibit human trafficking, and in reverse, it encourages human trafficking. And in my opinion, these two laws should be amended urgently. If we don't amend these laws, or some would argue that nightclubs and similar places of entertainment law should be cancelled immediately. In my opinion, it should either be cancelled or amended in a way that would prevent human trafficking happening in the nightclubs. So I see these, especially these two big legal frameworks, as very dangerous, and I believe that they cause systematic human rights violations, unfortunately. So this is the situation, the legal situation in the northern part of Cyprus. And when it comes to international students and human trafficking, why international students are in risk of human trafficking? Well, basically, first, international students belong to the migrant community. And according to the global data, migrant population is, they are the most risky group of people in terms of human trafficking for a number of reasons. The first reason is the language barrier. And they don't understand the legal documents they're signing. They may not understand the content of the job. They may not know where to seek help because of language barrier. Even if they reach to the authorities for help, they may not be able to express themselves freely to the authorities. So language barrier is one of the factors that adds to their vulnerability. The second factor is that migrant populations rely on third parties, either for education, work, or any other purposes. So they don't directly contact to their employer, let's say, or in the cases of the students, to the university itself directly themselves, but they contact it through an agency. So they rely on third parties' information or assistance when they decide to move to a new country, which also adds to their vulnerability. The other element is inadequate services provided to the migrants. Well, in Cyprus, according to the laws, the protections provided to non-citizens and international students as well is very limited. So what kind of services I'm talking about? I'm talking about social, psychological support, decent services provided by the authorities according to the human rights standards, for instance, right to interpretation. or right to legal aid, or when you don't have a place to stay, the right to shelter. These kind of basic rights are lacking in our local legislative system. So this is also one factor that makes migrant communities and international students vulnerable. And inadequate knowledge on local legislation and procedures. Yes, most of the migrant population and international students have challenges in terms of understanding the local legislation, which is very understandable. And they may not be able to read the law, understand the legal procedures or remedies provided to them. Lack of human rights mechanisms in the country. This is present in the northern part of Cyprus. The human rights standards are low, and the protection provided to people facing with human rights violations are very low. So that also adds to their vulnerability. And the risk of being irregular and hence deported back to their countries, because non-citizens rely on residency permits for staying regularly in a country, they also embrace the risk of being irregular. And once they are irregular, they face the risk of deportation, which gives a really important tool in the hands of the traffickers to use it against them. So how does it happen in practice is that when the trafficker knows that that person is irregular, they would immediately threaten them, saying that they would report them to the police and they would issue deportation orders against them, which they do actually. Some traffickers have very strong relations with the authorities, and they do initiate these kind of deportation orders, unfortunately. And then we should bear in mind that migrant population is not a homogeneous one. Involving the international students, there are different kinds of vulnerabilities, and we should approach each case with an intersectionality approach. So socioeconomic levels, gender, sexual identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality, age, ability, and disability status are some of the factors that we should take into account. For instance, if we are talking about a person that has in their home country an active conflict, and when they know that they cannot go back to their country because of fear of persecution or basically fear of being killed or abused, so these leaves them very vulnerable in the country that they are currently staying. In our case, it's North Cyprus, because they know that they have no other option and they should stay here. And this makes them very open to target for traffickers to use these kind of vulnerabilities. It doesn't have to be always active conflict. It may also be that that person might be gay or transgender or a woman, for instance, and might fear that if they go back to their home country, they will be abused by their family or partner or anyone around them. So this is also one of the vulnerabilities that we should bear in mind. And we know that the irregular migrants are even more dangerous, and traffickers most often use this as a tool to control victims. So if you are irregular, you are really, really in danger, especially in the North Cyprus, where you have almost no kind of protection provided to you under the law, and the arbitrary authority of the migration police officers is very high. So this is the legal facts and the legal context here. I know it doesn't sound very promising, but there are many challenges that has to be changed, that has to be dealt in the field, and I know that there is no established protection mechanisms for the victims, which gives a huge responsibility to civil society organizations to provide services and protect the victims. Under the international standards, providing services to victims and their protection it goes under the responsibility of the state, not the civil society. However, because of the gaps in our system, the civil society does a lot of the job that states or the governments have to be doing in North Cyprus. So I will introduce you two organizations. One is Refugee Rights Association. I am a member of the executive board of the Refugee Rights Association, and up until last April, I was working for the organization as a project coordinator in an anti-trafficking project funded by the EU. So I just provided the contact information here, but let me explain you what are we doing in the organization. So Refugee Rights Association was first established in 2009 to provide legal, social, and psychological assistance to asylum seekers and refugees. The Refugee Rights Association also worked very hard in the field for the promotion of the refugee rights and for advocacy for legal change in terms of establishing an asylum system in the north. Through time, the organization enlarged their areas, and they started working on racism and human trafficking as well. So what do we do for refugees or human trafficking victims is that we still continue to provide legal, social, and psychological assistance. And for refugees living in the north, we help them to find jobs, for their access to health, access to education, and any other problems that they face in the north. We as an organization try to assist them to come over their problems, basically. And for human trafficking victims as well, when we have a case, we assess the case and we refer it to the relevant bodies or organizations. And in our case, for human trafficking especially, we have a new platform, the Human Rights Platform, that currently provides free legal assistance to human trafficking victims. So Human Rights Platform is a new one. It's established last year by Refugee Rights Association, Queer Cyprus Association, Universal Patients' Rights Association, Turkish Cypriot Human Rights Foundation, and Civil Society Initiative. We recently launched a new project in October, yes, 2 months ago, basically, October this year. And we have 5 thematic areas that we are working on: refugee rights, human trafficking, democratic rights, LGBTI+ rights, torture, and ill treatment. So we provide legal aid in these 5 thematic areas, and we took over the hotline that was established by the Bar Association 2 years ago on human trafficking. The hotline is now being implemented by the Human Rights Platform, and I just put the hotline number here in case you want to just note it down. The hotline is open to everyone. It's not only for potential victims. You can also report the case if you think that there is an indication of human trafficking around you. It might be your friend, it might be someone you know from school, or someone you see in the street, your neighbor, or whoever. So you can also report the cases that you hear or you suspect. We'll go and investigate these kind of cases, and we would try to approach and access to the victim and interview them and try to provide them services for their protection and for them to access the appropriate legal remedies. So basically, this is it, but I will now stop sharing. It's 7:30, but we do have, I think, half an hour more, or no, I'm not sure. Kayam? I think we do have half
I think
an hour
we do
more,
have
right?
time for questions now, so we can take your questions, everyone. Fezile, of course, this was brilliant.
Welcome. And I hope, I mean, human trafficking is very complex. It might be a training for 2 or 3 days even. I try to really provide you the most important information. I hope it's clear for everyone. And but if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer. Yeah, Kaya, go.
Yes, okay. So I really wanted to ask you about, since the legislation is relatively new, what were the challenges that you faced in that sector pre-legislation, before there were laws that could possibly help you and aid you in helping potential victims?
So what are the challenges we are facing now, although it has been criminalized?
Before and now, what did anything change? Because according to what you said, there aren't any prosecutions.
No. So before it was criminalized, basically there was no definition in the law as well. So what would we do if we have a human trafficking case? We would go to the police under forced labor, which is not a heavy crime, forced labor under our criminal code. It has a sentence up to 3 years only. So compared to human trafficking, it's not a heavy crime. Or we would go, if there's a physical abuse, we would go with physical abuse as well. If there is any kind of commercial sex involved, we would go with assisting prostitution clauses or providing premises for prostitution. These kind of articles that are not mostly heavy crimes under our criminal code, but we will try our chance with these kind of articles. Now that the law changed, at least when we go to the police, we can say that, look, this is human trafficking, and these are the indicators, these are the elements, acts, means, purpose, the ones that we discussed in the beginning. We can all prove to the police that the elements are there. But what happens in practice is that either because of lack of capacity or because of political unwillingness, or both together, because if there's a political will, I think there would be capacity anyway. So this goes hand in hand. The police officers, when they have a human trafficking case, they don't want to open the file under this article. They don't want to investigate under human trafficking. They would try to convince us to go under less heavy crimes like the ones I mentioned to you. And they would tell us it's difficult to prove human trafficking. We need a lot of testimonies. We need a lot of witnesses, and we need a lot of elements to prove in the court. So it's difficult. Let's not go with the human trafficking. When we insist that it's human trafficking and they should go with that, Bar Association even complained against few police officers in the past, like last year, for not performing their duties fully because they rejected investigating under human trafficking article. But what happened in this kind of cases is that police took the cases because under our local legislation, you have one case in the police, and then the police completes the investigation, prepares the file, and sends it to the prosecutors, the Attorney General's office. And then from the Attorney General's, the case is brought before the court. So what does the police do is that it has been, like, for instance, we have a case from last year involving a woman forced to work in the nightclub, 7 women. They were reported to the police, and it's been 1 year that police is still investigating on that case. 1 year. So what the police does is that they just lock the cases in the police, because if the case goes to the Attorney General or to the courts, there are much more things that we can do. But in the police institution, our access is limited, their capacity is limited, and the system is locked there. So there's not much that we can do from there. That's why there has been no single conviction. There are complaints and there are files in the police now pending for investigation. But they don't complete the investigation, and they don't take it before the court, unfortunately. That's the reason. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so can we kind of infer that maybe authorities are complicit because human trafficking is profitable at the end of the day? Is this a safe thing to assume?
Mm-hmm. So with the police institution, I have different conclusions about it, basically. First, yes, there are police officers that are directly or indirectly earning interest from human trafficking. That's one thing. But I don't think that the majority of the police institution is like that. I think there are few police officers like that. Not that I think, I know, like from cases. But if they're not being proven before the court, which is very difficult to do so. But my assumption is that there are few police officers that do cooperate with human traffickers. But there is also the other side of the issue, that there are police officers that want to do something about human trafficking as well. They either lack the capacity in terms of knowledge, so they don't know what to do, they don't know where to look at, they don't know how to investigate such a crime, because the police institution didn't provide any kind of training to them when this law was, adopted from the parliament. It's also civil society that they did provide a limited kind of training opportunity. And when we had training opportunities to the police, there had been some police officers that wanted to join, but basically their superiors didn't let them. So there is also this kind of issue that some police officers want to do something about it, but either their superiors don't want them to improve their capacity, or they just can't improve their capacities, or sometimes they do proceed with the case, and their superiors would stop them or would tell them, you shouldn't care about this case that much. There are also cases like that. So it's a little bit complicated, but generally speaking, I see that a significant amount of police officers want to do something about it, but since there is no good political because they don't trust their knowledge and they don't know what will be the consequences for their career. That's I think that's the reality in the police institution. And Palma?
Okay, well, I have like a lot of questions, so I'll try and like summarize and condense it. You said that some of the laws encourage trafficking. I think there's another law that looks a bit suspicious to me. I don't know what you think about it. There's this thing where if you want to come to Cyprus and work, your employer has to invite you or something like that. I'm not sure of the full statement in that law. But do you think such things like getting an invitation by an employer and then you get a work permit cause people to be trafficked even more?
The law that you are mentioning that you are referring is the labor law. Yes, there is such a system. The employer has to invite you. You need to find a job and then come to Cyprus. I don't think that it directly encourages, because in most of the countries it's like that. In order to get the work permit, you need to have a job beforehand and have a contract with your employer, and then come to that relevant country. And under the labor law, it also abolishes, there is a problem with my connection, or do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, and then under the labor law as well, there is a clause on agencies, which says that agencies, like using third parties for recruitment purposes, is prohibited. This is in our law. This is stated in our law. But when you see the practice, there are many agencies, labor agencies, that recruit people, and no one is investigating about these agencies. No one monitors their work. So this is also very dangerous. Although the law prohibits it, we know that in practice it does take place. But how these agencies, you might come across these agencies as well, how do they establish in law technically, is they register themselves as counseling services, not recruitment agencies. They register themselves as, counsels who just give suggestions to people or advises on working conditions in North Cyprus. But what they do actually is recruitment. We know that, but no one is going after that kind of agencies. They also have very strong relations with some politicians and local authorities.
Okay. And the second question is, you said people are encouraged to report cases if they think there's some trafficking going on. Is there a form of protection for people who report cases? If it's not you or your friend, there's some things that are like common knowledge, like how you said some laws are not practiced. Some people might know that certain people take passports away from their employees or international students. So if you report such a case, are you protected? And how much proof do you need to bring to the human rights platform or to the police?
So if you report such a case to us, for instance, not involving not you, but a third party or your friend or anyone else, we would first try to reach to that person to see whether they can communicate with us. Sometimes they cannot because of their traffickers or because they're too afraid to be deported or to be reported to the police. Then we will try to seek information from other kind of sources. In all our practices, we endorse no harm principle. This is our priority. So whoever you report to us, we would prioritize their safety first. So for instance, 2 weeks ago, we had someone reported us a case of a woman in a nightclub and told us that she's pregnant, she wants to escape, she's being raped in the nightclub, she doesn't want to live here and stuff. And in this case, what did we do is, for instance, we never called the victim or the potential victim because you would never know where are they or who answers that phone. So it's very dangerous. What they would do is that we just send a message through WhatsApp in their own language is, when you have time, would you please call us? This kind of, not a message that will alarm people around that person. And we did that in this case, and we start texting, and she texted us back. And she told us at the end that she doesn't need protection, she's okay there, and she doesn't want us to do anything. And we stopped. Probably, according to my experience, she was under threat or control. That's why she wrote like that in the WhatsApp message. But we didn't move further with the case, because if we try to go into the nightclub, if we report to the local authorities, then the trafficker would get much more aggressive against her, and we wouldn't know how to protect her. So in this kind of cases, we always prioritize the safety and needs of the victim, and what do they want to do is the first question we ask. So, yeah.
Okay. And in that case, if she continued to press charges, would she be allowed the right to an abortion, since last I checked, abortion is illegal in North Cyprus?
Abortion is legal up until 10 weeks. And if it's more than 10 weeks of pregnancy, then unfortunately abortion is not legal. Yes, and there are no exceptions.
Even in the case of rape?
Yes, unfortunately. That's something that we wanted to change 2 years ago. In the law committee of the parliament, we went to the parliament for like 3 months discussing with the MPs. Didn't happen.
Okay. Okay. I think one more question. In the beginning, you said trafficking. Sorry, guys. Trafficking is moving like the person from one point to another. Does the amount of distance count? Like if it's within the same city or something, like telling someone to come to a party and they think they're there to enjoy themselves, but a man has paid you to bring a woman for him, would that count as trafficking?
Yeah, the distances doesn't matter. Most people think that trafficking should happen in another country, that it should be, you should pass a border to call it human trafficking, but this is a general misconception. Trafficking can happen in the same city as well, in the same country, it doesn't matter. So.
Okay. And just to comment, you said that hate speech is a crime?
Yeah.
But what about the Facebook scene of North Cyprus where hate speech is the order of the day? Do you have to press charges or does social media not count?
The hate speech is a crime for three factors, for three protected characteristics that are gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Race is not a protected characteristic, for instance, under the law, or nationality or ethnicity or ability, disability status, this kind of, status are not covered. It's only these three characteristics that is covered by the law. And Queer Cyprus did report more than 100 hate speech cases that happened in digital, world. Digital platforms, I may say, Instagram, Facebook, mail, and they did report, I think, more than 100 hate speeches to the police, and the police took them and they said they will start investigation, but no, we don't know what will happen. There has been no single conviction on hate speech as well, and no cases were brought before the court. The thing with the North Cyprus is that the court system, the judges are much more progressive compared to the Attorney General or the police. So we are strongly confident that for hate speech and for human trafficking as well, if a case goes before the court, we are very confident as civil society that the judges would make the right decision according to human rights standards. We are confident about that. But the problem is that the cases cannot go before the court. That is the problem. But probably, it will. It's been 2 years, but I assume that soon enough we will start having cases, hopefully, before the court, and we will see what would be the charges. Yes, Makazi?
Thank you, dear. I have a question. Since from all that you said, I think to ensure that survivors of human trafficking have access to their human rights, there's a lot has to change with regards to the legal side. So whether it's amending legislations or implementing legislations or capacity building of those responsible for implementing it, so much has to change. And I want to ask you, how do you predict the future to play out? And what role does civil society organizations like VOIS or the average citizens, whether it's an international student or a local citizen, what role can we play in making the future a safe time for survivors of human trafficking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good, Makazi. These are questions that I thinking randomly throughout my typical working day. Before pandemic, I was much more hopeful about the general situation, and I could really see a way forward before the pandemic, because right before the pandemic we were working on a comprehensive legal text with political parties on human trafficking that would include protection of the victims as well. And we were very hopeful that in 2021 or even in 2020, we would be able to adopt such a legislation in the parliament. But the pandemic changed everything. I'm not saying that if pandemic wouldn't happen, that we would be in a very good situation right now. I'm not suggesting that, but for me, my hopes are almost not existing right now because of the situation. But before the pandemic, I was much more hopeful. Before the pandemic, we did increase our collaboration with some key MPs that wants to work on human trafficking. There are 3 or 4 women MPs that they were very eager to work on human trafficking. But now I see that we lost that motivation with the MPs as well. So the pandemic, political instability, economic crisis, that all added, to this crisis that we are facing right now. So I'm not hopeful at all at the moment. I think that what should be done immediately is to adopt a comprehensive law on human trafficking and immediately establish a shelter house for the victims. And if we have the law that grants the rights to the victims, and if we have a shelter house, and if we make amendments to the social welfare's responsibilities as well, I think we would solve half of the problem, because we would provide enough rights to the victims. And then the rest would be civil society's monitoring activities, whether the state is doing their job properly or not, and advocacy for improvement. But right now, we are in a very, very difficult position in terms of human trafficking, because we provide almost no rights to the victims. So when the victim approaches to my organization, all I can do is to provide legal aid. Apart from that, I don't have a shelter to refer that person. I don't have a psychologist full-time. I don't have someone that would help her with her social life or jobs, to find jobs, to gaining new abilities. These are all parts that in human trafficking literature, especially, that has been discussed very commonly in the literature, that the victim has to be empowered, and they need to be able to find decent jobs. They need to have psychological support. They need to have economical support, at least for a period of time, until they start healing from their trauma. So these are very important. But currently, all we do is to help them legally. And in some cases, for women, of course, we refer them to the Women's Shelter House in collaboration with Ömer Hoca. And that's all that we do, actually. We don't have any other kind of services right now. Yeah, not so promising, I know.
Yeah. But hopefully, Yani, with all the civil society organization work, because I really admire the structure of civil society organizations here in Cyprus, it really speaks volume. So maybe it's going to be like challenging all the obstacles that are facing human rights access, basically, to humans.
Yeah, definitely. And what do we do? Like, how you can support us is like through advocacy. Like you can help us in our advocacy work for a comprehensive legislation for shelter house. And you can also cooperate with us if you have potential cases of human trafficking. I mean, you can directly refer it to our hotline, or to me, or to any of my colleagues in the platform directly. So you can alert us if you see anything in the field in terms of new forms of exploitation, or any kind of trends that you see in the student population, for instance. We really look forward to receive your suggestions, and if you see anything alerting your organization, then we would be open to listen it, because you are in the community. You have daily communication with foreign students or with other young migrant workers here. So I'm sure you witness a lot of things in your daily life. So I mean, we want all this kind of information that are very useful for us, for advocacy and for protection of the victims as well. So yes, we will see. I mean, now we have elections, which human rights is not a topic. It's not like in their agenda, but we are now starting the new, propaganda kind of period for this upcoming 2 months. We will monitor the politicians, MP candidates. We will try to pressure them in terms of human trafficking to, advocate for human trafficking, to make promises about human trafficking. We will do all these kind of things. And what we will do in the Human Rights Platform as well is we will monitor and report the rights violations in the North to international reporting bodies, such as the UN and Council of Europe. Because of the Cyprus issue, the human rights violations in the North, they are not being reported in international reporting. So this is one of the major gaps that we identified in the field. And when they're not being reported, the politicians feel no obligation to do anything about the human rights because they feel like no one cares. But we want to change this understanding in our new project in Human Rights Platform through monitoring and reporting, hopefully. Yes. Thank you. Or suggestions? To contribute. Makasih, Sharif, for your questions. Thank you, Amro. And for the others that I didn't have the time to, the opportunity to meet, I hope we meet at some point in an event or in any other panel or training, kind of activities.
Thank you,
Yes,
Fezile.
I think that's
I'm
all.
really, really, really grateful to have you. The information you have presented us was more than it was like I was thirsty and you gave me water. It was very on point and very informative, and I can't thank you enough, of course. Unfortunately, there was an power outage in Mausa, and that's why a lot of the participants weren't able to reconnect back. But hopefully we're gonna meet again on December 10th, the Human Rights Day. I believe you will be in attendance. And I want to tell our fellow attendees that the deadline for registering is on the 8th, so make sure you attend. Of course, you're gonna see our sweet and humble and absolutely, I can't thank you enough. We're gonna see Fezile as well on the panel. So thank you, and I'm very grateful. If you don't have any more questions, then we can conclude. If you have any concluding remarks, Fezile, please let us know.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. And I forgot to thank to Nancy as well. She helped us to organize this. Thank you, Nancy. And
thank you for being here, Fezile. We really do appreciate your effort and time. I'm really, really grateful, and I'm sure we got to learn a lot today. Me in particular, if you notice, I was more of a listener because there's a lot of information that I learned from this workshop. So for that, I'm really appreciative. And yes, I look forward to seeing you on the International Human Rights Day.
Yeah, looking forward to it and to meet with you all in person. And thank you very much for inviting me. If you have any questions, you know my email address. You can always reach me. If you hear any cases, you can reach our hotline. And don't forget to follow Refugee Rights Association in social media. We will have social media accounts for Human Rights Platform very soon. It's now being developed by our communication expert. And once it's done, we will announce our social media channels for the Human Rights Platform as well. So stay tuned for that. And thank you and have a good evening, everyone. It's great to see you.
Thank you. And we wish you the best on your future endeavors. I really love the initiative. And everyone, happy to have you, and hope we're gonna see you again on the 10th of December.
Yeah, I think I had a small connection issue, but now I'm back. Okay, yeah. I hope to see you all on the 10th as well. It was great to see you. Thank you very much, Taya. Have a nice evening, everyone. Bye-bye.